As far as renovation is concerned, Alpla provides a series of tools that allow me to generate comparison drawings. In this regard, it is necessary to use project templates, area styles, line styles, layer sets, and so on. Now let's see how, thanks to the graphic override, I can significantly simplify all the phases. Initial steps in which I need to pre-configure everything. To do this, I will use a somewhat particular technique. In other words, instead of reading the status information directly from my object, so each time project status, demolition status, existing status, and so on, we will work based on layers. So I will be able to modify or alter the representation of my objects based on the layer that I assign directly to my objects. Be careful, I'm not talking about the format properties that are assigned to layers, but rather about the possibility of applying a graphic override so that, for example, if the name of the layer starts with RSDF, why does it start with that? Because clearly it could be an RSDF SL, CQ, SC, and so on. For example, therefore I use the wildcard technique, the asterisk. So if it starts with that particular name, then I want a specific graphic representation to be applied to it. The exact same thing applies to all elements that are related to the project status, and in a similar way, this is also true for elements that have or are associated with the demolition layer. Why do we work by layer and not by individual attribute in this context? Because by doing so, afterwards I can disable the demolition layer, turn off the graphic override, and thus obtain the project status. On the other hand, by utilizing all the available layers in the project and keeping the graphic override active, I'll be able to get the comparison drawing. At the same time, it's also important to assign not only the layer to objects, but also the information, so the attribute for demolition, project status, and as-built status. Why? Because obviously that information becomes crucial for extracting, for example, legends or reports. At this point, the question is, how can I do it in a single step? What's the fastest way to assign both the layer and the attribute information in one go? I could use different types of functions each time I perform this operation, but if I want to do it all in a single streamlined step, I could use the well-known function, restructuring conversion. However, focusing attention solely and exclusively on the layer and only on the information without defining pen, line, and color, and without specifying any type of fill representation. But let's see everything directly inside Allplan. Here I am inside Allplan, where I have my survey in an as-is state situation. At this point, what can I do? So, first of all, I'd like to remind you that the graphic override information is something that is defined at the project level rather than at the office level, just like any other type of resource. In this regard, let's take a look at how the default set graphic override works, the one that comes pre-installed with Allplan. So let's see how the design status works. It essentially requires that the status attribute is defined each time as project status, existing status, or demolition. So if I go and change that type of information, for example, to demolition, I get the desired representation. Let's say that by doing this, I'm not satisfied. So I take a step back. Let's go back into the graphic override. In the graphic override, I've created an example here where I read the name, or rather the prefix of the name of my layer. Why the prefix and not the layer itself? Because maybe I want to differentiate my components across different types of layers. So if I use my custom graphic override and change the layer of my wall stratum, let's select, for example, this demolition layer from the available renovation layers. It will automatically turn yellow. I'm still not satisfied. So I need to find a way to assign both the layer and the information at the same time. So I could conveniently use the renovation conversion function. By carefully disabling everything that is related to the modification or adjustment of the graphic representation of my component, I'm able to focus solely and entirely on the layer itself and the specific information that we are assigning to it. Okay, so what do I need to do now? I select the demolition switch and then I simply select what I want to demolish. What am I doing? I'm changing both the layer and the information in a single step. So we're demolishing some walls, demolishing some openings, for example, this curved wall and these other two walls with their respective windows and doors. We click apply, and there you have it. The correct representation appears of my elements. At this point, let's try adding some new elements. First, I select some existing objects that are useful to me. So with a right click and detect, I generate them. Next, for example, I'll go ahead and insert a brand new opening section right here in this specific position, just as an example. So now I'll call up the renovation conversion function again, and I'll specify that some elements need to be converted to the project state. So I select my walls, I select my objects. Here I accidentally selected the label of the previous door as well, but that's not a problem. I'll just put it back into the demolition state context. Next, I'll use the demolition body function just like before to do what? To fill in the openings that we've demolished. Let's move to the layer palette, possibly using the LL keyboard shortcut, and disable the layer that contains the demolished elements. If I now also disable the graphic override, I find myself directly in the project state context. So here I've inserted my document and I'm going to make a copy of it within my layout. Therefore, in the second document, the project state, I won't use the graphic override and I'll simply tell it that I don't want to see the demolition elements. On the contrary, in the first document, I'll assign my graphic override, and so I'll get the classic result. Comparison table.